We're going to get our luncheon program underway with a short video, and then we'll have our speaker come up.
The International Space Station is the most fantastic vehicle ever built.
It's a one-of-a-kind laboratory orbiting about 250 miles above the Earth.
And we perform experiments on the International Space Station.
We can do science, we can do experiments, we can learn how to do things out of this world. And the result will help benefit the people on the ground.
The space station really provides an opportunity to explore, for example, say medical applications.
The aging and the osteoporosis and muscle wasting conditions are greatly accelerated in microgravity.
The weightless environment will give us insights into things like diabetes and maybe even cancer.
Understanding those phenomena allow us to look at how we can improve treatment of disease here on Earth.
If we wouldn't have conducted experiments on the ISS, we wouldn't have known that you could use cold atmospheric plasma in such broad application areas we're now exploring.
One of the most promising results has been gained by studying a protein associated with Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
We may be able to slow the disease by half, potentially doubling the lifespan of many of these DMD patients.
We provided iServe imagery for many, many natural disasters, including floods and fires, for deforestations, for volcanic eruptions, and for earthquakes. So it was really a fantastic example showing how imagery from the International Space Station could be used in these times of dire need.
This was when we realized we had a chance to make a difference in the world using the same technology that was used by NASA, but applied in a remote area of a developing country.
I think it's made people much more aware of the issues of water quality. That's a very powerful thing.
Having the HYCO on the International Space Station has been the ideal test bed for our research.
We can monitor these water bodies from space, and if we can reduce exposures both to humans and even animals, then we've achieved our goal.
And now today, we're able to operate the largest fleet of Earth imaging satellites in human history.
And none of that would have been possible without the International Space Station.
The space station has done so many things for life on planet Earth. It shows us what human beings can do working together. It shows the science that we can discover.
Over 2,000 experiments have flown on board ISS. 170 countries around the world have participated in some fashion, either in the ISS itself or in one of the experiments. Our rate of research is actually increasing. We're doing more today on board the space station for research than we have ever done before, and that's only going to continue in the future.
And so what we're seeing today is a proliferation of new ideas and new concepts. It's almost like it's a renaissance of what's happening in space. Buckle up and strap down, because this is going to be a rocket for all of us in the global community to be part of.
Our speaker for our luncheon is Greg Johnson. Greg is a graduate of the Air Force Academy and went into the United States Air Force, was a fighter pilot and a test pilot. He was selected as an astronaut in 1998 and flew on STS-124 and 134, the last flight of Endeavour, which took the alpha magnetic spectrometer up to the International Space Station. He was appointed the president and executive director of the Center for the Advancement of Space and Science and Space, and is now in that position. And I'll turn it over to Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Abbey. Wow, it's been 20 years since we first met. And thank you for inviting us and the CASES team to this conference. I'd like to, you've heard from Dr. Mike Roberts, and he's actually going to finish up the presentation at lunch, and then we'll have probably a little time for Q&A. But Liz Warren's also here. Dr. Warren is part of the CASES team, and we're excited to be here at the conference. The panels have been super exciting, and I love the healthy debate. I think I contributed to it this morning. But again, it's the notion of not having a position, but tossing out, asking a question and thinking about the possibilities. It's nice to see former colleagues from the astronaut office here. It's a pretty high population. I'm impressed that so many of you are here. Bill Shepard was in and out, and it's been over 17 years that we've had continuous presence on the International Space Station. And this year, the students, some students will graduate from high school who have spent their entire lives with somebody 24/7 living and working on the space station. That's just amazing. Also, I wanted to acknowledge one other group because it resonated with me what Jack said at the last panel, and that's the relationship between the crew members and the flight docs. And I know there's a lot of flight docs here, so I'd like to thank you all for working with us and enabling us to fly. That's so important. When I first started as a fighter pilot, I did also not trust the flight surgeons, and I hid everything I could from them. But then during Desert Storm, my tent mate was a flight surgeon. And unfortunately, during the Desert Storm, I seriously injured my spine. He was an orthopod. He actually wrote a paper on my back, published it, and I was like his pet project to get back flying again. Got back in fighters, got into the shuttle, and managed to, with the flight docs here and many of the flight docs in the room, overcome many health challenges and make a contribution as a productive crew member on the shuttle. I took that kind of collaborative spirit from this wonderful group here about 4 years ago to join this mission at CASES. And it's been a really interesting challenge. It's been about teamwork, it's been about collaboration, understanding the differences, taking the time to learn about the person and not be a barrier to what they're doing, but actually enable them to think differently and still work together. So without further ado, I'll get on with my slides. First slide, the objectives of CASES, we're the managers of the ISS National Lab, and we're working in coordination and cooperation with NASA to maximize the use of the space station. And so our goals, our overarching objectives are very similar to that of NASA and the International Space Program, just to maximize the value of this wonderful asset in space to the nation. So leadership, it's about leadership, and you can see a picture of the rodent research hardware, and Kate Rubins is here somewhere, and I remember we were office mates and you were on the phone in the early stages of talking about making this capability, and we are leaders in bringing facilities up to the space station that we have had on the ground, and now we have these capabilities in space station. So looking back just from 2009, Kate, and now we have an amazing institution to study rodents and many other things on the International Space Station. And that's where I come to the second photo, which is, it's moving, because I think they're beating heart cells that, Kate, once again, I think weren't you the one that was taking this video? And so we've had beating heart cells in space. It's about discovery, it's about innovation, it's about science, but it's also about STEM. And everything that we do on the space station can be wrapped in an education wrapper. And so that's one of the areas of our mission focus. And here it's hard to see, but Jeff Williams is up there. We had a downlink about 2 years ago at the USA Science and Engineering Festival. And 350,000 students and teachers and parents were inspired at that conference. And one of the big highlights was an interview. Jeff and I, the last time we saw each other, was that interchange. And those are two Nickelodeon stars that the kids understand and communicate with kids to motivate them to be inspired by science, technology, engineering, math, and the arts. I said that for Jancy. Okay, I'll get it moving faster. So what is CASES? I said there were the managers of the ISS National Lab. 2005, the space station was designated as a national lab, and then 2011, about the time that I landed my final shuttle flight, around that time, we completed the assembly of the space station, and so the nation was thinking about different ways to maximize the use of the space station. And so by legislation, we created a not-for-profit called CASES in Florida to look at the space station differently, to generate non-traditional innovation in life sciences, physical sciences, remote sensing, technology development, and education, to benefit the planet. And so it's about value to our nation in these different ways, and I'll talk to that in a second. So what's the opportunity? Well, NASA has traditionally focused on everything, right, for decades. And so now in this new kind of generation of maximizing the value of the space station, we're looking at different players who never even thought they could get on the space station. So half of the capability of the space station, half of the crew time, half of the up mass, down mass, half of the powered up mass, half of the airlock cycles, and of course it's not exactly like that. But we've been transitioning to use half of the capability of the space station to do these different things. We've also been focusing on the facilities on the space station, the rodent research hardware being one of them. And so there's so many more opportunities for academic institutions, other government agencies, and particularly the commercial market. And it was earlier said, it's easy to say and harder to do, and that's true. But we're right in the center of trying to build this commercial demand using these new facilities on the space station. Transportation and crew time, right now, while we've got the space station and we have the National Lab, it's a free ride to and from the space station, and free, subsidized access to the all parts of the allocation. But at the same time, we're trying to build that demand, so we're getting skin in the game from these other government agencies and these commercial companies to use the space station that could then unburden NASA in the future. And in this, public-private partnership, as we progress from zero to something that approaches the cost of the space station, we're building that capability. And over the last 6 years, we've made some significant progress. This NASCAR slide kind of puts all of what we do into one slide. Gerst has the slide that goes to Mars, and this is kind of our slide. So on the bottom, you can see the demand, some of the demand players that we're trying to build. You'll see small companies, you'll see large Fortune 100 companies, you'll see academic institutions, and we're building a demand. I said supply, but I meant demand. The demand for use of the space station. In the middle, you'll see the sponsored programs, and that's a way we've been successful in building outside funding, non-NASA, non-CASES funding to solve big problems. And so we've seen other government agencies committing tens of millions of dollars now to solve problems. And Mike's going to be talking a little bit about the details of some of those sponsored programs. But we also have commercial sponsored programs like from Target, and you'll also hear about a sponsored program at the end of my talk. That's a very interesting one that we had this past summer. And then on the top, it's supply with a small s, not launch supply, but the facilities that are on the space station. And over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been growing the commercial capabilities of the space station with the pre-existers like NanoRacks and Teledyne Brown to new players that you may not even recognize, as we're building capability on the space station that then can be used to not only solve problems for the users, the customers on the bottom, but also create a business model for those suppliers on the top. And then finally on the right, you can see the investor network. And what we do there is we're not brokers. What we do is we just want to increase collisions between those who are interested in space, the new spacers, the Space 2.0ers, the guys with the pointy shoes and no tie on the West Coast, and collide them with the people with ideas and get real investment on the International Space Station. And then once they make the connection, we step back, let them work their thing, and then hopefully we'll have, we have had new interesting projects on the space station. Keeping it moving, one of the big initiatives that we started about 1.5 years ago was how do we measure value? I mean, what is the why of why we do these things? So we created a process with industry experts, best practices, to analyze our projects, looking back retrospectively at our projects and understanding what value they bring, and then also prospectively using these elements of innovation, discovery, and social humankind impact to understand what projects will be the best ones to select in the future. And on the bottom, you can see feasibility factors. And so what we do is we plot the value of a project with the feasibility of the project, and then we get a plot where we can better understand what the why of why we're doing these things. We've had very interesting results come out of these now 2 annual panels that we've had, but now it's embedded in our process. And we're finding that projects, obviously, we want to avoid these, and we want them to go here, but these 2 regions are also important. This is the high-risk, high-reward kind of projects, and we want to see those on our portfolio, as well as the projects that are very feasible, not as high of impact, but they're using the allocation that we have on the space station. And so we can plot all of our projects over time and migrate the projects, work with the projects to make them more ideal, more impact, and reduce the risk of those projects. And so this methodology is very interesting, and Julie Robinson's out here somewhere, and we've been talking about how we can work together to not only analyze the national lab projects, but also all of the things that we do on the space station, and maybe set us a process for analyzing anything that we do in outer space for space-based research. So with that, I'm going to leave you with a video. It's a fun video. You could probably drop the spotlight if you could, because I want you to see it in I don't want it to be faded, but if that's not possible, that's fine. But after this video, then Mike Roberts is going to talk about the real science. I know this room is populated with deep scientists, and I'm not that person, but I do try to surround myself with super smart people, and you've heard from him, and you know he's really, really smart, and really glad that he's on our team, and he's going to be talking about the details in a second.
I want to thank the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space for helping our mission grow beyond the boundaries of Earth's gravitational pull.
As one of the most common genetic contributors to Parkinson's discovered to date, LRRK2 is the focus of intense investigation by Parkinson's researchers.
So LRRK2 is one of the most common genetic causes of the disease, and for over 10 years, no one has ever been able to crystallize and solve the structure of LRRK2. And we're hoping that under microgravity conditions, we will improve the resolution.
It has been proven in the past decades that crystallization works better under microgravity conditions, and we hope that this is true for LRRK2 as well. Having the atomic structure will allow us to design LRRK2 inhibitors, and those LRRK2 inhibitors can be developed into drugs in the end.
We're incredibly excited to be able to work with Cases on this project, and we're willing to go to the ends of the earth to try to solve the crystal structure of LRRK2.
We're thrilled that PD Research has been selected to travel to the International Space Station, and honored to partner with Cases on behalf of the PD community here on Earth. Thank you.
Yes, so I know that was for the video and not for me. I feel a little bit like stepping up here as a relief pitcher. So Box did a great job of giving us a big lead, and I'm going to try not to give the game up now. So what you just saw with the video from the Michael J. Fox Foundation was an area of research in the space environment that is very much on the fundamental end of the spectrum. As I'm sure most everyone in this audience is familiar, you look at R&D activities along a spectrum. Some of them are very foundational, trying to understand the principles of the system or the disease state that you're looking at. Others are more translational in nature. You've got an idea, you think you have some idea of a causative agent, and you have a therapy in mind or some mitigation that you can put in place to reduce the risk of onset and progression of that disease. With protein crystal growth in the microgravity environment, we've seen a very expansive use of microgravity on the discovery end, folks trying to understand more about the physical structure of a particular therapeutic target, something that a protein that is produced in the body and could act as an agent. We've also seen a significant uptick recently in the use of monoclonal antibodies and physical structural information used on those. And that level of structural information and detail has now moved to not only include X-ray diffraction capabilities, but it's moved in to the use of neutron diffraction so that folks can actually get an idea of where the protons are, which are extremely important in the catalytic activities of many of the therapeutic agents that are involved. So we're very proud to be able to enable access to the International Space Station National Laboratory for those investigations. At the same time, there are also investigations such as this one, which I think will be familiar to many of you in the audience. Stem cells are an area of that have been an area of active investigation and significant investment from both the private and the commercial sectors for many years now. And they display some unique characteristics in response to that space environment. So stem cells, unlike most of us and our children, display a trait called immaturity in the spaceflight environment, which we embrace. One of the things that you would like to be able to do with stem cell populations is grow them to sufficient density so that they can be used for therapeutic use. And there are multiple experiments now utilizing microgravity in space and simulated microgravity on the ground that indicate that there's a unique aspect of the exposure of those cells to that simulated and actual microgravity environment that enable the cells to maintain their level of immaturity or stemness. That has useful applications downstream for therapeutic uses. There are a multitude of approaches that are currently being tried in order to develop ways for therapeutic use of stem cells. One of those is a system based on decellularization of organs and tissues. Another way is using bioprinters. One approach is essentially bottom up and the other one's top down. And the microgravity environment has impact on all of those approaches. And if we can go, oops, I went too far. We have a video explaining this approach to utilizing stem cells in a microgravity environment.
We've created a model of the human lung that has most of the cells in it that a lung would have, and we're going to use this model to evaluate what happens to your lung on long-term spaceflight. We're using stem and progenitor cells. They're the cells that give rise to the cells that allow you to have gas exchange and breathe. The larger mission is to eventually someday be able to, instead of make pieces this big, is to make a lung this big for transplantation for somebody. If you're going to look at what atoms do, that affects a molecule, that alters a cell, that changes how a tissue responds, that alters how an organ functions, that changes how you function, you have to be able to walk it back and say, I can look at it at these small levels and build this picture of what's happening in a person. That all may be very different in space because microgravity influences everything that a cell does. And the opportunity to have a chance to send an experiment to space and get data back is huge for a scientist. It happens once in your lifetime.
So the only issue I would take with what Dr. Nichols said there was that the The opportunity to do research in the space environment shouldn't just be a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. It should be an opportunity that is frequent and accessible because of the creation of a national laboratory that enables access for folks to do research utilizing the right tool, and microgravity being one of those tools in that environment. Dr. Alessandro Grattoni, who's shown in the lower right of this photograph, is also part of that work with Joe Nichols. And I wanted to highlight this experiment as well, which is the mice just arrived at the animal care facility in Kennedy Space Center this past week. And this is an example of where you have a translational model. Dr. Grattoni has now flown 3 experiments to the International Space Station National Laboratory. The first one looking at the development of an algorithm for microfluidics channel systems for drug delivery, passive systems for drug delivery in implantable devices. The second step in that experiment was looking at the actual device itself. The third experiment that will be flying in these mice is looking at the implantation of that device and the delivery of a drug in a mouse model on board the International Space Station. So Dr. Grattoni's lab has gone from what was essentially fundamental discovery and validating the algorithm that they have in the microgravity environment, all the way through to a translational animal model for doing this. And this is not the only example that currently exists in our pipeline for doing that. So there are opportunities across the board, not only for individual investigators, for academic investigators, and for funding agencies to enable access to the International Space Station. They can do it in serial fashion in repeated experiments. In order to enable continued access to the International Space Station National Laboratory, CASIS is very actively engaged in developing sponsored programs, some of those highlighted by Greg earlier. So we not only reach out to academic institutions who have funding, we not only reach out to the commercial sector and the venture capital firms to supply funding for areas of research and technology development. We form active partnerships with existing federal agencies, in addition to NASA, to increase the volume of financial capital that's available for doing R&D activities in space. One of those partnerships that we currently have is with the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, which is the newest of the 27 institutes and centers that are part of the NIH. NCATS has pioneered, through their funding, along with funding provided by DARPA, the development of tissue-on-chip systems, or microphysiological systems. These systems have the potential to one day replace animal models, the use of rodents, for drug testing. So they're of great use and utility and interest to the pharmaceutical sector. They also have the ability to have significant impact upon personalized medicine and the way that you would develop a line of mitigations for crew members or tourists who want to go into deep space. With the advent and tools of personalized medicine and omics, you can now get a very deep understanding of what our individual responses are to particular environments or to particular therapeutic drugs, so that a flight surgeon can actually tailor the appropriate level of exercise, the appropriate diet, the appropriate therapeutic interventions that are necessary to sustain a crew member or a tourist for long periods of time. This technology is pretty new. It's only been actively funded in mass for about 5 or 6 years now, but in that 5 or 6 years, NCATS has funded multiple investigators who have already demonstrated the capability to recapitulate the function of several different organ systems. And some of those are now going to be able to go to the International Space Station National Lab to understand the effects of microgravity on those particular systems and the utility of the tissue-on-chip platforms for use in that environment. This partnership has enabled access to over $12 million in NIH funding given to a sponsored investigation. And NCATS has now signed on 2 more institutes within institutes and centers of NIH, and a new solicitation will be coming out in the next year. Just to touch on a few of the investigations, there are 5 investigators that have been selected for this first round. And I wanted to emphasize that CASIS and NCATS worked very hard in order to enable multiple flight opportunities for these investigations. So each of the selected investigators is working on a milestone-driven model that NCATS and DARPA have used very successfully before for investment in tissue-on-chip platforms. Each of these investigations has been slotted for 2 different flight experiments in succession. So they will have an opportunity to fly, learn, and refly again with the added experience and knowledge they gained from that first flight, rather than necessarily having to come back in with a new solicitation. And I just wanted to highlight that the tissue systems of interest range in complexity from brain, looking at the blood-brain barrier, to immune system, to musculoskeletal, to lung host defense, and to the function of kidneys in the microgravity environment. I would highlight that all of these are areas of significant interest for pharmaceutical discovery and medical intervention here on Earth, and every single one of those ties into risk factors that NASA Human Research Program addresses every day in trying to ensure crew health and performance as we go deeper into space. And with that, Greg and I would be glad to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
You stand in front of the mic, I'll just be back.
You hide?
No, I'm just kidding.
Now I'm showing.
So I have a question now. Other than the force vector of gravity, or the absence thereof, are there any other factors that are important in your view for the experiments that you're conducting?
Yes.
Can you tell me what they are?
Yeah, so obviously there are other things that are going on with the exposure of any biological system to the environment in space. We talk about it a lot, especially with the rodent research model, because every time you do one of those experiments, you typically will have a ground control. You may have a control that's run in different hardware on the ground than what's in flight. So there are differences with G-load going up to that orbit. There's certainly differences, slight differences in radiation environment. There's certainly going to be differences even in other environmental factors on board the International Space Station that are not faithfully replicated in the environmental control chambers back on the ground. We know enough now from study of rodent systems, rodents used as models, that they're sensitive to changes in who the caregivers are going in and out of their animal care facility. And certainly the environment on board the International Space Station is not the same as a vivarium environment on the ground. In addition to that, with cell-based systems, we're only now starting to understand the physical forces that are placed on things as small as cells in that environment, and having a better understanding of the design of bioreactors and those systems that we use to recapitulate the environment on Earth. So one of the major advantages that we see for cell culture in that environment is the ability of cells to stay in suspension for longer periods of time as they begin to differentiate and form into tissues. But I don't pretend for a moment to understand what all of those physical effects are as those cells and tissues change.
So one of them is one of the principal problems in the experimental work on Earth, and that is understanding fully the vibrational spectrum under which the experiment is being conducted. Mm-hmm. So do you know that spectrum that well?
Yeah, so there are certainly parts of the station we know are more jittery than others. There are obviously, devices that are used to give you an idea of what the G-jitter is for different systems on there. There are designs of bioreactors that use some sort of a rotational system to keep cells suspended so you can kind of dampen those effects. We've actually, CASIS sponsored a technology developer who was developing a new damping system to be used for support of experimental payloads to remove G-jitter and other factors there. So there are folks that are working on and starting to think about it, and certainly as we move farther into the era of omics, we're going to discover that there's a lot more noise in that system than we encountered, simply because we don't fully understand what all of the variables are that we're measuring in those systems.
Thank you.
Can I want to take a please. If I understood the question correctly, though, and again, I'm not a scientist, but I would say I think your question was is it just microgravity, but is it something else? And there are a lot of other areas that are fruitful on the International Space Station. Being outside of the atmosphere, we can, the environment of being out there in the vacuum, the hot and cold swings, tech demo, TRL raising. There's a lot of different projects that can use the space station as the only humanly tended satellite to do interactive work and use human innovation while you're developing a technology. And I know it's a limited orbit, but Earth observation can be a very fruitful area. Not just looking at the Earth, but also looking out of the heavens. I mean, AMS is technically part of the ISS National Lab, and we're learning new things. And if we can figure out how to solve problems here on the Earth, Target has the Cotton Sustainability Challenge. They put up $1 million to better understand crop yields, as well as a microgravity component to better understand the seeds themselves. But there's many, many uses for the International Space Station in addition to the microgravity component. And
CASIS is a few years old now. Looking back, what were and/or what are the challenges that you found in increasing the uptake of use of space for research?
You want to start? The challenges are many. It's a diverse crowd, and our group is about facilitation. It's about understanding the differences. Some groups want to make a profit, of course, the commercial side of the house. There are organizations that have been this way for 20, 40, 60 years, and understanding how they operate and getting them to work together has been a great challenge. Funding is another challenge. I mean, we don't get a lot of federal funding, and managing a multi-billion-dollar asset on a very small budget is a great challenge. And so, this, the money that flows through CASIS is 15 million. I mean, it's going up a little bit, but the connection with over $100 million of non-NASA, non-CASIS funding, skin in the game from these organizations is the benefit and the management of this over $1 billion piece of the annual budget of the International Space Station. Of course, the asset itself is approaching $100 billion investment by the world. Do you have anything else?
I would just add, Greg hit it, but frequency of access, and then different constraints pop up at different times. Crew time is always at a premium. Having the ability, though, now to depend on the crew to go far above and beyond what's in their primary timeline, because science is so engaging for everyone on board the International Space Station, we're seeing those kind of move to the side now. And then there are always, as Greg highlighted again, increasing capabilities on station. It's not, don't think of the International Space Station as a built environment that's just sitting there. It's constantly being remodeled and modified. So there are new capabilities even into the biomolecular realm that are being added very frequently. And there are cutting edge instruments that are just showing up in people's laboratories that are under consideration for moving to station. So as long as those capabilities continue to increase, the frequency of access continues to grow, a lot of those barriers are being removed.
I may have missed the first part of this, but when you were talking about that chip and how it would help the flight surgeon modify the in-flight exercise prescription, that got my attention. So I'm kind of curious, are you gathering met rate data, heart rate? What kind of data are you gathering that's going to help us, along with our ACER, our strength and conditioning specialists, help us change in-flight prescriptions?
Yeah, so the comment that I think you're referring to, I made for the tissue-on-chip platforms. So the idea is that in the future, each of us will have a bank of our own cells somewhere that can be drawn out of a freezer and put into a device. So if the doctor notices that your lipid profiles are starting to go up, but they can't attribute it to any physiological function, you could actually take your cells out of the freezer, grow them up, and look at liver function in a chip, and a tissue-on-chip platform, and query those with hundreds of different drugs that you couldn't necessarily do from a physician's office. So you'll be able to have a personalized medical profile based on your own cells, but not requiring your own body to test them. That's the direction that personalized medicine would like to see for these tissue-on-chip platforms. That's over the horizon a bit, but it's something that they're actively starting to consider to use them for. The first and most important use, I think, from the pharmaceutical sector is going to be simply trying to replace rodent models. The rodent models have had many successes, but far more failures in translating clinical data that's useful for human intervention. Using human cells inside of those chips has the promise of being more reliable and providing data that you can rely upon more favorably.
Here, so I understand that most of your clients are private enterprises. Is there any level of organization whereby they might collaborate, share data, share information, share tissues, leverage off of one another?
Yeah, so all of the first 3 rodent research investigations that were flown, part of ISS National Lab, the first 2 were sponsored by Novartis, second was sponsored by Eli Lilly. Every one of those had active biospecimen sharing programs that were involved. So, and in one of those cases, Novartis was even flying a transgenic knockout model that had been developed and they had IP on. So where I would have thought there might have been some hesitancy on pharmaceutical companies in particular, but commercial companies in general, we haven't seen that. We've seen a great desire to utilize the International Space Station to address a question that's important to the research group, and they're all, at their heart, researchers. So they understand that their research and their results are going to be exacerbated greatly by sharing it with a greater community, including the specimens. So it has not been an issue.
Hello, just a question from the back. As we look at the ISS and we look at commercialization of the ISS, is there a plan in the future for cases to be involved in science and research involving human subjects?
Okay, so again, it's an evolution. And 20 years ago, 4 years ago, the promise of what the International Space Station would bring, there was a high expectation, and that hasn't changed. And so as we make progress in building this commercial capability, it's slow, and it's about collaboration, and it's about listening, and it's about solving problems in new ways, and some element of making it up as you go. Julie Robinson says that occasionally, and that's what's going on. It's maneuvering in relationship to the bandit, right? So in fighter pilot terms. So as we look at humans coming into the mix, there are companies, and one of them is Axiom, has a great interest, a business model of commercial human activity in space. So there's also a national component, I think, to that commercial activity that will still need to be leveraged for not just the interests of that commercial entity, but for the national good. And so, again, I don't have a crystal ball, and as we think through these different models, Bigelow has some thinking, Ixion has thinking, and then there's all the next step to competitors that have thinking, and then Axiom. As we think through how they want to commercialize space, I think it's about building teams. It's about understanding how everybody can help each other. So it's co-opetition. And Mike talked a little bit about, building this, can we share stuff? Well, at some point, there's going to be competition where the IP, the intellectual property, is going to be critical to these commercial entities for their secret sauce and making a profit. Because ultimately, there's going to have to be a business model for these companies to then offset the subsidy that the federal government has provided for these decades. So I'd say human activity certainly should be on the table. However, our mission is the International Space Station. We know that. And so to make the best use of the space station, our focus has to be on, using this asset. How can we creatively facilitate innovation, help companies grow and make a profit and find a business model, But at the same time, what follows the space station is relevant as we work through this mission. So it's a great question. Human activities on the table. We don't want to compete, though, with commercial operations. We want to facilitate and help them all work together. So it's an interesting problem. It really is. But I think that human activity, I mean, if we're going to get 10,000 people to space, we're going to have to, get the first grouping of people, and it's not just going to be tourists, it's going to be people who are working and living and doing commercial work in space. And so I think the nation has an interest in developing that capability. All right. How much time do we have?
So, is there one, George, is there time?
One more question. I'm sorry.
So one more question?
I thought we had 15 more minutes.
So, NASA Space Technology Mission Directorate recently supported the creation of 2 research institutes, one of which was biomanufacturing, and there's a lot of synthetic biology in that. DARPA is showing a big interest in biomanufacturing. Is CASIS thinking, are they working with STMD on these projects, and is there a way of leveraging that interest to create a kind of commercial capability on station for some of these endeavors?
So we're not working actively with Space Technology Mission Directorate. We are, however, working certainly with DARPA in exploring pathways for the Living Foundries program and other programs like it to have access to the space environment where appropriate. And we're certainly very interested in the activities of Adam Arkin and others who work in that field, because that's one of the sort of great undiscovered countries, is looking at microbial involvement in biomanufacturing approaches in addition to additive manufacturing capabilities in the spaceflight realm. So we are having those discussions, but we're approaching them parallel to NASA, not through NASA. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much.